My name is Janeen Mason. I'm the curator at Lighthouse ArtCenter right here in Tequesta, and we are celebrating our 55th year. Nancy Polich is our executive director. Yay! And we have a number of board members in the audience. Can everybody who's on our board raise a hand, please? Thank you so much for being here tonight. This is such a special occasion for us, isn't it?
It is.
I know. So, we're grateful that you're here. We can't believe that in our little corner of the universe, we got building Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, which we could not have done without you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
On our panel tonight, we have, I'm going to step right here. We have Peter Lawson-Johnston, and many of you, of course, know that Peter is the grandson of Solomon R. Guggenheim. We have Jane Davis Doggett, Florida Artist Hall of Fame. And of course, you all know this, but there might be a couple of people in the audience who don't. If you haven't gotten lost in an airport, you have Jane Doggett to thank. And Scott Hughes. Scott has the architecture in this half of this room that you see. Listen, with every show I do here, I learn so much more. And this is what I've come to believe. Architecture might very well be the mother of all of the arts. I didn't know that.
I've heard that.
I didn't know that. You may have known that.
Heard that.
It's like a giant sculpture, right? Like walking inside a giant sculpture. Thank you. But that's enough out of me. Let's listen to Peter, shall we? This man actually met Frank Lloyd Wright on more than one occasion. Hi, Peter.
How are you?
I'm so glad to be here tonight. You know, we started this conversation 3 years ago, right? Where's Nancy Turrell? Way in the back, Nancy Turrell. Nancy Turrell is the executive director of the Martin Arts Council. And for years, we did something called a cultural conversation in Martin County. And I was interviewing artists and performers and musicians and conductors, and then one year, Nancy said, you'll be interviewing patrons this year, which is when we met. And we couldn't have done any of this without you, Nancy. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I should probably say this too. Nancy Turrell, where's Pat Williams? Pat Williams, would you two both put your hands in the air? We have 2 members of the Florida Council on Arts and Culture here in the house with us tonight. The 3 of us started something called Fund the A-List. Florida, if you didn't know, has lost 93% of our funding for the arts in the last 5 years. The graph looks like this. And so these 2 have been working like crazy to get the legislature to change that this year. So you might hear more about it. If you do, know that it's these 2 crazy women, and somehow I got to tag along. Peter, it's so good to see you again.
Well, thank you. Well, I thought I might just say a few words about when I was quite young, when I got to know my grandfather, Solomon Guggenheim. I knew whenever my mother would take me to see him, I was in tall cotton, as they say. He seemed to be reasonably well off. And I visited him many places, his plantation and his home out at the ranch in Idaho. But I saw him most of the time out in Sands Point, Long Island. And he had a lovely home there. And I remember he used to like to have me join him for breakfast, and I thought that was sort of a big deal. And I remember that in the evenings, he had a valet who would dress him into a tuxedo just to have dinner at home, just the family. I was very impressed by that. Maybe that's one reason I'm wearing a tie tonight. But then at cocktail hours, the butler would bring in a tray of well, it turned out to be orange blossoms or something, orange and I think it was orange juice and gin. I've forgotten what they call it, but I was allowed to have just the orange juice. I remember. And I remember one time sitting in that environment, my grandmother was saying, Saul, I did buy a necklace today, and I was under the impression it wasn't a very inexpensive one. And he said, that's just fine, Irene, but who's been in my gin? He thought the bottle was a little lower than it had been the night before. Gin. But anyway, really, what I should be talking about is the fact that I met the Baroness Hille-Rebbe, who did his portrait, and he, I think, was intrigued with her, this German Baroness Hille-Rebbe, and they must have had conversations while his portrait was being taken, and it wasn't long after that he became very interested in what was then called non-objective art. Now they call it abstract, or I don't know what they call it now, but then it was non-objective art. And so he decided he'd start collecting non-objective art. And my grandmother and the Baroness and my grandfather went to Paris and Germany and met those artists that, Kandinsky and Mondrian and all those fellows that were, at that time, I don't know whether they were starting out, I'm not that knowledgeable. But he acquired quite a bit of the paintings at that time. And when I visited him, he had the Plaza Hotel in New York is where I saw him a lot. And they were on the first floor, I think it was. And my grandmother's suite was on the 58th Street side, and it was all ancient art, as I would call it, or you might call it, and had nothing to do with non-objective art at all. It was just so different. But then you'd go down the hall to Grandpa's area, and I remember the toilet in his bathroom was purple and all that sort of thing. And it was a whole different atmosphere. And I remember being very impressed at quite a young age with a beautiful Modigliani. And that was my first exposure to nudity, I suppose. Well, not my first exposure, but first experience. No, it was not an experience. But anyway, one thing led to another, and there wasn't room for any more art in the apartment, and so the decision was made to get Frank Lloyd Wright to construct a building that would house his collection, and obviously the Baroness took credit for picking Frank Lloyd Wright, but I read the minutes when I became president of the board of a meeting around that time when I went over all the minutes of the years, and the minutes reflected that the Baroness had taken credit for picking Frank Lloyd Wright, but it was my grandmother that chose her. So, we sort of kept that a secret, I think, until tonight. Anyway, that's the thrust of what I had to say tonight, and I look forward, as you do, from hearing from my two contemporaries.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Jane.
Well done. You have done this before.
I have a surprise for you. Jane told me this story that when she had graduated from Yale, her friend Bill Short, who was the superintendent on the Guggenheim project, called her and said, "You better get over here right now. Frank Lloyd Wright is in the building. Bring your camera." So I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked, Jane, to find that magazine and those images? And I think I did. You talk to them. I'm going to go get it.
You got it? Good heavens. Blow the dust off. Actually, it was quite an honor because the Architectural Record had asked me to photograph the Guggenheim under construction. So when Bill Short was, he and I were contemporaries, we were the same age, and he was an engineer, and I had graduated from Yale. So we...
Where'd you go?
Boola boola. So what have you got, Jane?
This is what I have. Ready?
Oh my heaven, you found the article. Oh.
Wait. What
that great?
happened? Can you say that again? We found it. 1958.
Oh my goodness, look at that.
The second
This is the Guggenheim.
architectural
Yeah,
record. I just
yeah,
want to
that's
tell you.
unbelievable.
You
And
probably
photographs
know
by
this.
you.
Yeah,
They
good for
went
you,
All
Jane, my
magazines that are
gosh.
This is great.
368 pages at a time.
And
They're
those are my
downloadable.
photographs.
Oh, my
They're
goodness.
not
See, they have the
searchable.
drawings. The record has the
Yes,
I
look
spent
at that.
all this time and finally.
Jane, you have to be happy about
Can you
that.
all see some of that?
Is this
It looks
exciting?
like Dr. Caligari's workshop. You know what I mean by that? No, you don't. That movie?
Dark and scary.
Dark and scary.
Right, that's
Yeah,
what it looks like.
Right, well,
Yes.
I mean, doesn't that look dark and scary?
Very.
do you think that's the photography, or do you think that's...
No, it's a photographer. You know, it's a
I'm
camera.
kidding, I'm
That's-
kidding.
I think this was just right. This is when he went around. You remember that he discovered that they had the restroom on the top tier,
Right, and
and they had forgotten to bring the pipes.
yeah.
And
Awkward.
It's a challenge when the building's made out
he
of
was in
concrete.
a terrible mood because of that.
Yeah.
And so he ordered pipes, and I think they got their act together and got the pipes. And that is apropos of what he said once in a lecture. He didn't think America had, look at that,
Yeah.
had,
Beautiful.
God, Janeen, wonderful. He didn't think America had architecture because he did architecture, and, no one else could, obviously. So he once said in a lecture, he said, well, when they dig up America, they're going to find a lot of plumbing, show that we were a sanitized nation. And he said, that's what they're going to find, not architecture. But anyway.
But Jane, you went into wayfinding too. So,
Two, yeah.
and now here you are, beginning your whole second half of life here. What awards have you received this year? It's,
Well,
now,
I
mind
got
you, it's
the-
only like the 15th,
Oh,
right?
no, I got the environmental award by the Society of Environmental Graphics.
How nice is that?
The Lifetime Achievement.
The Lifetime Achievement Award.
They dug me up out of the tundra. And so they're now giving me all this recognition, that because I'm still here doing things.
Still kicking. I have two people in the audience who were like dying to meet you. Kevin Cohn, and is Mike Crow here? Mike Crow. So this is what happened with this exhibition. Your people made this so doable for us, and I am so grateful.
Arts Council.
Well, the Arts Council and the Guggenheim created something that we could put together here. So
Right.
what happened was I got these digital photos. They came over the internet, and then we had them printed here. Now, Kevin Cohn did the printing, and the huge pieces were also done here in South Florida. But Kevin, when he knew that you were going to be here tonight, he was like, oh, I would really like to meet her
Hi,
because, look at there, because they use everything that you taught
Oh, that's
every day.
wonderful.
This is your business, right?
I know that.
You and Mike.
I didn't know at the time I was inventing. You don't know, you just do things.
Can you
But
give us-
apparently I was inventing.
Influential.
Influential, I guess.
Anyway.
And she knows everybody, but of course you know that she knows everybody, and so does Peter. Hi, Scott.
Hi.
I mean, this is all seriously tall cotton, okay? You're right there in the middle of it. So what are you working on these days?
What are we working on these days? We do have a number of projects in the office. Some of them are popping up on the screen behind you. Sometimes you can tell if it's a rendering, it's probably in production. But we're working on an edition for the Pine School, and I'm hoping everyone will be aware of that. It's going to enable the lower school to be able to have a gymnasium and to have a performing arts center, something this school is desperately in need of, and looking for some support from the community. We are working on a private prairie chapel for a family in Minnesota that's made out of a reused barn material. That's actually quite exciting. And we're doing a project in Key Biscayne right now on the original piece of property that the owner of the island created, a little lagoon. 2 acres purchased for an outrageous amount of money, and a young man is lucky enough to have obtained it. And now that house is on Hutchinson Island. That's being completed right now. This is Holly Lane. It's a project that's here in Jupiter. That's not far away on the river. But the Key Biscayne house is one that we're focusing on. I think it'll be quite exciting, actually. And a few on Jupiter Island that we can mention as well.
So, you know what, I would not be doing my job if I didn't say this. So, you know, we've just started an expansion campaign. It's just beginning. And boy, would we like to have information from you. This is something that our community is going to be very involved in, too.
Oh, we would love to get involved.
We're absolutely growing this place.
We would find that would be a great honor for us.
I'd love to know more about it, okay? And
great.
so keep your ear open for that as opportunities arise. So Scott, now did I understand that you worked in the office of Frank Gehry?
No,
Okay.
no. In fact, I didn't know Frank Lloyd Wright.
Not Frank Lloyd Wright.
Can't contribute to that at all. I did work with Philip Johnson, who did famously say of Frank Lloyd Wright that he was the greatest 19th century architect that America had. But there may have been a little competition going on.
Okay.
May have been a little competition. I did late in my, well, not late in my, I was very fortunate enough in my 40s to be able to go back to school. I recognized that there was an opportunity for me to sort of re-energize some of my visual instincts, and I recognized that the things that I was interested in were going on in California. And at that time, Frank Gehry, who I hope most of the people in the audience know who he is.
Guggenheim Bilbao.
Guggenheim, Bilbao,
Okay.
a number of projects that are now going on in New York. The New World Symphony in Miami, the Disney Hall in Los Angeles are those that he's done in the United States. He started a school with a number of other architects, Tom Main, Eric Von Moss, not necessarily names that you would recognize, but well known in Los Angeles, and they started an architectural school because they felt that they were not given the freedom that they wanted to have in the California university system. So they started a school called SCI-Arc, Southern California Institute of Architecture. And it is now, I think it's in its 45th year, definitely a sort of a gathering of very creative, avant-garde, perhaps more artistically minded architects, and I knew I wanted to be involved with them. So I called them up, you know, would you be interested? I was already an architect. Would you be interested in spending some time with me? And they agreed to take me in, and I was able to do a little bit of teaching, but also I was able to get some time with Frank Gehry's office. I actually did my thesis with Edwin Chan, who designed the Bilbao for Frank Gehry, as well as, I don't know if any of you have been to Joanne, help me, in Paris, the LV Museum. That is spectacular. Wonderful, and that was a great, great educational experience. So that, yes, to answer your question, to run on
In a
little
roundabout
longer.
way.
Yes.
Okay. Peter.
I'd like to say one thing.
Yes, please.
Before your question. Robert Moses was, I don't know what his title was, but he had everything to do with what was built and not built in New York City. And he really gave us a hard time, and it took us a long time to launch the architecture.
So
I remember there was discussion at the time of putting it in Central Park, of having the museum in the park.
Yeah, he was more against that than where it was.
And I think
He wanted you to put it in the Bronx, actually along the river. He found a spot that he thought was more appropriate. I happened to bone up on this a little bit.
I think you know more about it than I
I
do.
just read something on it. I read something on Wikipedia yesterday.
So here's the question. He went under contract. Frank Lloyd Wright went under contract with the Guggenheim in 1943, but construction didn't start until 56. And that's because there was so much pushback from...
Well, there was the death of your grandfather was, I think, part of the delay, was it not?
Yeah. My grandfather had a great sense of history. I remember motoring, as he called it, whenever you went from some place to another of any distance. And my grandmother had suggested that we stop to see Mount Vernon. And he delayed in getting out of the car, and my grandmother got out ahead of him, and then we delayed a little longer. And then he said, "Peter, come with me." And we went to an area where there was some shrubbery. And he had a great sense of history. He said, "Peter, I want you to tell your grandchildren that you and your grandfather watered George Washington's lawn." I wouldn't have mentioned that, but I knew you'd all be fascinated.
So Jane, are you aware of the fact that the Guggenheim actually was based on a previous design that Frank Lloyd Wright had done that had not gotten built? And it was actually upside down, so that the lower floor was actually wider than, and it sort of tiered and went up, and it was actually for a jewelry store on a small site. And so you worked your way up, and when he got the commission, and it was actually very kind. Frank Lloyd Wright had a very lengthy career, and it went up and down. He was chased out of Chicago because of the Mann Act, because he had had an affair with one of his client's wives and had taken her to St. Louis, and that had forced him out of town, which resulted in his going to California, which is why he did the project in Tokyo. And he was only because of the success of the Tokyo Museum that he was able to come back to the United States and reestablish his career, which led to the project in Falling Water that I believe your grandfather was so taken by that gave him the chance to continue on so late in life in his career. And he died 6 months before the building was done in 90. He was 96. I don't know. He was old. Architects live to be a long time. So that is something that annoyed Philip Johnson a great deal. That he was able to get.
We do have in common, Scott, that we both worked for Philip Johnson.
I didn't know that.
I did the Niagara Falls Convention Center with Philip, and we won the American Iron and Steel Award, and he didn't win anything.
Not surprised.
But he hired me again.
Yeah.
We were out in New Canaan at the time, so he was, he had the glass house. The glass house.
The glass house.
That,
there's a biography that recently.
But I had at least the inroad to be able to call him up and say, "Philip, I've got these crazy architects in town. Can we come over and see the house?" "Well, yes, Jane, but you came last week." I said, "Well, I just want to make sure that I still have entree." But that would happen all the time. We'd have people there to come. And I was thinking about...
Did he have a lot of staff there at the time?
Well, they were revolving doors.
They were revolving, right, but that may not have been staff. But
he was delightful, and he was wonderful to work with. He was creative, and I know the biography that's come out recently, which I haven't read, but the Times wrote it up and said, you know, that he wasn't a great architect.
Right.
That he was philosophically.
Well, he would in fact introduce himself not as the best architect, but the most famous architect, and that may work for you.
Yeah.
Was how he sort of opened up his
But you know, talking
conversation.
about Frank Lloyd Wright, when he, again, he was disdainful of other architects. I just don't think he thought very highly of them. But it was wonderful that your forebear was challenged by him, wanted to get the great out of falling water, which just, that was the most exciting house at the time that we'd ever seen. And I know when I saw it, when I went through it, the last time was about 10 years ago, I guess, sometime. But anyway, when you walk up the levels of that house, the water actually changes in sound. And it's just, and I don't know if he knew that. He would probably say he knew that. He knew that would happen, but I think it was something that just happened.
Well,
Mr. Lawson-Johnston, I'm gonna ask you some questions. I'm sorry, Jean, to interrupt. When we met just a minute ago in my office, you said that much of your career on the board of the Guggenheim has also been reimagining some of the things in order to accommodate the changes that have happened in the Guggenheim since Frank Lloyd Wright designed this space. Can you give us a for instance?
Well, I think the most notable coincidence or instant is Bilbao.
Oh.
And maybe I could tell the story.
Oh, please do.
The Basque government approached us and suggested that we have a joint venture in Bilbao. And I remember saying to Tom Krenz, our director, I've never heard of Bilbao. And he said, well, it's in the Basque country, it's in Spain. And I said, well, is this something that we've got a lot on our plate? Is this something that we're interested in? And he said, well, I don't know. And the understanding from our point of view was that it would be their money that would do the project. And so Stretch Gardner was on our board, and a wonderful man that just died recently, and a close friend. And I mentioned at his funeral a month ago that I had conferred with him about what our approach should be, and he said, why don't we just sort of make an impossible demand and nobody's feelings will be hurt, and you know, we'll see what happens. So he came up with the idea that we would ask for, back then it was a lot of money, $100 million to build the museum, $50 million to put art in it, and a little cheekily, $20 million for our endowment in New York. And we thought, well, that'll take care of that. 3 weeks later, they said, okay. And now we're called visionaries. But they were the visionaries because Bilbao was an industrial town, iron ore or something, and nobody had ever heard of it. Nobody went there, and they thought if we can attract people, you know, it'll put us on the map. And they were the visionaries and deserve a lot of credit. And, you know, we get about 1 million visitors a year at the Guggenheim. They've been getting, for the last 20 years, 1 million visitors a year.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's been a success, and we're very proud of that. We're now doing something in Abu Dhabi that hasn't quite gotten off the map, onto the map yet. But the Basque,
they don't have the needs that.
They don't have what?
They don't have the needs that Bilbao had.
No, but we, you know, Frank Gehry was the thing that we did in Bilbao, and Frank Gehry is doing our Abu Dhabi project also.
Wonderful.
I hope he lives long enough because it's been very, very slow getting on because the price of oil, I think, disappointed the government, and it slowed everything down.
Nancy, can you tell me what time it is? until 7, so we're sort of wrapping up now, okay? I could go on forever. I'm sure you could too, but it wouldn't be fair to you all because we're making you wait for dinner. Let me ask you this. If you had one story that you think most people wouldn't have heard before, what would that be? We've heard about watering George Washington now. We're taking that home, okay?
That's pretty good.
Oh, gosh.
There's so many.
I do think that one interesting thing is, you know, after Frank Lloyd Wright built the Guggenheim, there have been some changes. He had a driveway going through, and we also had to build a tower because, you know, there just wasn't all that much room in the Guggenheim, and museums involve a lot of employees and a lot of... I never did have an office there. There wasn't room for me when I was the head of it. But I think that the fact that we had problems building, expanding, and it was actually Frank Lloyd Wright's son-in-law, I think. You would know more about that than I would, who was an architect who had something to do with our building the tower.
Gwathmey Siegel did the
Gwathmey
work.
Siegel actually did it,
But
and
with
he
the-
was a little critical because, I don't know why, but I do know that Mrs. Wright wrote a letter to the New York Times, a letter to the editor being very critical that we were destroying her husband's masterpiece. And I just wrote back and said that, you know, the masterpiece was really still there, but there had been additions, and we just needed more room, and we think that we got the best advice we could get from Gwathmey Siegel, and we did it. I don't know if this is interesting to you at all, but just...
Well,
You asked me something that I hadn't thought of.
I know, and I'm sorry for putting you in that spot, and you did
Well,
a great
I
job
don't
with the
mind
answer,
it
too.
because these people have all fit us into their busy schedules
Yeah.
tonight, and they wanted to make sure that they heard something.
We want them to get their money's worth. Send them out happy.
So, Scott, how was Gwathmey Siegel, am I saying that correct?
Gwathmey Siegel.
Gwathmey
Charles
Siegel,
Gwathmey, yes.
related to Frank Lloyd Wright's?
Not at all. They were a
child
New
now?
York firm who
Okay.
was selected as the best candidates to do the addition for what was really an administrative wing. The museum needed to take advantage of all of the original space for gallery area, and so they did what I think is really quite a sophisticated and background building that I think made the original building all the more powerful. So it was a great success.
Wesley Peters was his son-in-law.
Right.
Okay.
I'm so bad on names, but I came up with it.
Me too. Twice. You came up with the name of the man who gave you so much pushback, too.
And didn't he marry Stalin's
Good job.
daughter?
No.
Peters.
I didn't follow that.
Yeah, he did.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Small world, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Jane, when Peter's daughter, Wendy McNeil, came through the other day, she saw these images that we have, and she said, "Why have I never seen these before?" She said, "This is beautiful. We need to move it to the Guggenheim." I said, "Yes, we do."
Yeah, that's the
Yes.
first thing she said. We should have this same show at the Guggenheim. We've never
She said,
done
"Our
it.
board should see these images." I said, "Send them down. We're expanding. We could use their help." So, hooray. This is such an opportunity. But I would be remiss if I didn't say to Mrs. Jane Davis Doggett, hi. It's so good to see you again. And you've got so much going on. What's next?
Well, I think next is whether I'm going to sell my house or continue to bail, you know.
Or continue to build nothing like
Yes.
hurricanes.
I've gotten kind of used to hurricanes, you know. Oh, here's another one. Let's see, there's Irma and Francis and Jean.
So if you don't
They
know,
become, you know, by names, we remember them.
this piece on the back wall is the Jane's model of her home, which, by the way,
We did that model in 2 days. It was a study model. It's certainly, Scott, not a model I would.
Beautiful model.
it's
And
available, by the way.
the fellow that worked on it was intrigued with painting the ocean.
Yeah.
And he put a shark in it somehow.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Terribly bad form.
And there's a beautiful documentary, if you haven't seen it, of Jane that's rolling right there. And we got, Peter, I have to show you this before you leave tonight. When you go around this corner, there's a television screen in this corner. And there's 6 minutes of archival footage, which the archives discovered. And as far as I know, it's never been seen before. It's black and white. There's no sound. But these are the guys actually building the Guggenheim. And when you watch them...
They have no shirts on.
Yeah, no shoes and no sunscreen. And they're using, you know, saws, like not those, no hard hats. And remember, before there were tape measures, there were those, what are those called? Right? And I'm sure that everyone had slide rules. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing. Make sure you see that before you go. I'm so proud of this show, and I'm so grateful. So grateful.
Thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done, guys. Way to go.
Before we let this amazing team go, does anybody have any burning question?
I think we got it covered. Oh.
Good job. Oh, wait, there's one. Oh,
I was wondering for Jane, because I'm so interested in what you've developed.
This is my new fan.
this is your fan club, yes.
When I was kind of reading the stuff that you developed, thought came to me of you spent all this time with the typography and the colors and the visual aspect of wayfinding. Is there anything of another sense that you ever used in wayfinding to coerce people to go places or?
GPS.
Ooh. Ooh.
That's the future.
That was good.
We can retire. We don't have to do anything.
That was really good.
Plug you in. I know there's going to be a lot of technology with this, and we're going to have robotic cars and stuff.
yeah.
You know,
Driverless cars.
it's going to be a different thing.
Yeah.
But
You know, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Janeen coming up with all of these wonderful
Right. So
ideas.
we have to thank her.
But these people are my champions, so I couldn't have done it without them either. So thank you.
Thank you for
And
coming,
that-
everyone.
Yes, thank you for coming out tonight. We hope to see you again.